In this video, I will be reviewing The Iron Dream by Norman Spinrad, first published in 1972, according to my edition. The Iron Dream is the only book, I believe, that I have ever abandoned before finishing, and yet it has stuck with me afterwards. And I think that sums up the virtues and problems with the book. It's a very unusual idea. It is presented as an artifact from an alternate universe. In this alternate universe, Adolf Hitler migrated to America, eventually became a science fiction writer, and wrote in 1954 the book Lord of the Swastika. And most of the book is just that novel. And then there's an afterword supposedly written by an academic analysing the psychopathology of the author, basically. The reader is meant to be engaged with the story, excited by the story, and then when you read the afterword, you realise, oh yeah, this was written by Hitler. This reflects Hitler's worldview, and I didn't notice and I accepted it because the worldview of a lot of science fiction is so similar. And that is, of course, what Spinrad is critiquing. To some extent, this was successful in my case. There was a point in the afterword where the academic says, "Isn't it strange that there are no female characters in the book?" And I went, "Oh yeah, no, there aren't, are there?" And I wouldn't say I didn't notice as such, but I accepted it as sort of normal for the type of book that I was reading. And I think that, that says some obvious things about the type of book that I was reading, I guess, perhaps. In a science fiction book from 1954, it probably wouldn't be that unusual for that to be the case. At least, it wouldn't be noticeable. The plot of the sort of book within the book, the plot of Lord of the Swastika, is broadly the history of real-life Adolf Hitler. That is, the hero, Ferenc Jaeger, encounters a group of biker/outlaws who are analogous to the SA. He becomes their leader. He ends up fighting a genocidal war against mutants who are stand-ins for people the Nazis considered racially inferior, and in particular a group of mutants called the Dominators, who are Jews as seen by people who believe in a worldwide Jewish conspiracy. I have to say that I checked out. I stopped reading at one point when the Germany stand-in goes to war with the Soviet Union stand-in, and it's just depictions of slaughter for page after page. I wasn't sort of horrified and disgusted. I was just sort of bored. It was a little bit like my experience of reading Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf, you might think of it as being the sort of seductive rantings of a satanic prince. It's not. It's a boring little man going on and on about shit that you're not interested in. It only has any importance or interest because of the history that's attached to it. If it wasn't for that, it'd just be one of hundreds of things that would be for free on the internet, and you wouldn't download it, or you'd download it and read a sentence and give up. It wouldn't even be worth making fun of. And I think that's a reflection of the problem that Spinrad has, because on the one hand, he wants to make an engaging story. It doesn't matter what your lofty or ambitions of critique are if you don't tell a good story, but also he wants to tell a story that people are going to accept as something that Hitler might have written, and as something that is sort of fundamentally fascistic or fundamentally Nazi in its worldview. And there's just a point at which the two ambitions clashed. I just wasn't that interested in hearing about how the mutants were slaughtered. It didn't give me the satisfaction that it would give a fascist, I suppose. As I say, I didn't finish it, and yet it stayed with me. I stopped reading, and then I kind of read read the end later. I skipped a bit and then I read the end later and I read the afterword. I think that his underlying critique is fairly accurate. At least it's accurate about some books, some science fiction, if it's not true of the genre as a whole. Allegedly, a fan said to him, "You've written a pretty good adventure story. Why did you have to go spoil it with all this Hitler stuff?" Which he apparently took as proof of his thesis, I suppose. I'm also fairly sure that the role playing game Gamma World, which has a faction in it called the Knights of Genetic Purity, I think, they are sort of fascistic, evil pseudo knights who go around exterminating mutants. I'm pretty sure they're based on this book. And Gamma World is not a serious work of critique. It is set after a nuclear war, but it's the kind of after a nuclear war in which there are people with telepathy and living plants and stuff. It's not so much a realistic depiction of what life would be like after a nuclear war. It is very much escapist. And so, it was used as escapism, albeit the Knights of Genetic Purity are the bad guys. You're not meant to ally with them, but I bet some players did, given the nature of the people that I played role playing games with when I was young. Anyway, I think he has a point. It's not one of those books where you have a representation of a particular thing and you just go, yeah, but that's not what those people are like. Your critique is wrong, which is a feeling that I've had with, for example, C.S. Lewis when he represents atheists. In the end, it is a fairly interesting story. I mean, because of the nature of how it's presented, of course, you always read it with, as it were, with the author kind of looking over your shoulder, going, yeah, you're into this, aren't you, you little bastard? There's a certain sort of distancing that, I mean, to be honest, the fan is partly right. Maybe it does sort of spoil the adventure story, and maybe that is what I would rather have. But it is kind of interesting, his depiction of the world in which these mutants exist and stuff is kind of interesting. It's a bit like the world of H.P. Lovecraft in that I think, well, yeah, this is an interesting world. It's a pity that this guy was the one that wrote it. And so the characters are always talking about their disgust for Italians or Poles or whoever it may be, and you just sort of wish there was less of that. I would like to see a story set in the world of Lord of the Swastika, which wasn't written by Adolf Hitler. And maybe Spinrad would say that demonstrates the problem with science fiction or something. Maybe Spinrad would say that I just want my fascist tropes, but I want them a bit more disguised so that I can enjoy them guilt-free without acknowledging that that's what I'm doing. I don't know. I do think it's interesting. I think a lot of science fiction tries to be thought-provoking. This one actually is thought-provoking. Obviously, it doesn't quite succeed as an adventure story, at least it didn't for me. Having said that, I don't like military science fiction. I've read a few science fiction books and some fantasy books which are extended descriptions of fictional military campaigns, and they have bored and alienated me in exactly the same way. So maybe my reaction wasn't what was intended, and it isn't to do with the thesis of the book, and that's just my, I just personally don't like that kind of story, whereas other people do. But either way, that was my reaction, and I would say this is very, very worth reading if you can get a hold of it.